So I want to welcome you all. Harvey would know which Doolittle dinner this is, but I don't. This was actually Harvey's idea some years ago, and it's a great tradition, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to continue it. Tonight, I remind you, we gathered to honor the memory of a great airman and an MIT alumni, General James Doolittle. Our speaker this evening and the recipient of the MIT Doolittle Award is Admiral Roughead, the Chief of Naval Operations. It is particularly fitting that he is with us this year as the Navy is celebrating the 100th anniversary of naval aviation, and he will talk a bit about that tonight, later this evening after we dine. I'll introduce the Admiral more fully after dinner. I just want to take a second to remind you of a few highlights of General Doolittle's life and career. General Doolittle remains the only American to receive both the country's highest military and civilian honors, the Medal of Honor and the Medal of Freedom. We know him best for his famous World War II exploit. On April 18, 1942, then a lieutenant colonel, he and 79 other volunteers launched 16 B-25 bombers from the carrier USS Hornet to attack Japan. I remind you, and it's easy to forget, that the Hornet was also a part of this, and we should acknowledge that in the context of our guest this evening. On October 26, 1942, not more than 6 months later, the Hornet was sunk in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and it was the last of 4 major U.S. aircraft carriers. I guess this thing isn't working? Yeah. The Hornet was, from which General Doolittle flew, that carrier was sunk 6 months later in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and it was the last of 4 major U.S. aircraft carriers to be sunk in World War II, and I think the last major U.S. aircraft carrier to be sunk at all. So aviators paid a high price in the early years of that war in order to turn the tide in the Pacific. Back to General Doolittle and his unit, getting the heavily loaded twin-engine U.S. Army Air Force B-25 bombers off the deck of a carrier was a major feat of flying skill. It was not a planned mission for those aircraft, and was not a planned mission for the aircraft carrier. General Hap Arnold chose Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle to lead Special Mission Number 1 because then Colonel Doolittle was known as the master of the calculated risk, applying skill and science to pull off feats that seemed reckless and daring to others. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed during the mission, 5 were interred in Russia, and 8 became prisoners of war in Japan, and the rest made it home. General Doolittle himself bailed out over China, as many of the flyers did. He received the Medal of Honor for leading this raid and was promoted from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel, something which many people in this room I'm sure would like to do. When Doolittle accepted his Medal of Honor after the raid, he did so reluctantly, saying he would accept it on behalf of all the men who took part in the raid and vowed to spend the rest of his life living up to the honor. People forget sometimes that he had an earlier career. In fact, he was a prize fighter at one time in his life, which probably accounts for the great dotiness that he displayed in combat, and he often fought in California under the name of Jimmy Pierce. As I mentioned before, and sad for those of us who went to UC Berkeley, he did attend UC Berkeley briefly, but he dropped out to join the U.S. Army Signal Corps and to attend pilot training. World War I ended before he could fly in Europe, but he quickly became an accomplished pilot, and he was known as a bit of a stunter, and several of his stunts got him grounded. In September of 1922, he made the first of his many historic aviation feats, flying the first ever cross-country flight from Pablo Beach, Florida to San Diego in 21 hours and 19 minutes, making only one refueling stop at Kelly Field in Texas. In July 1923, after serving as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer at McCook Field, Ohio, Doolittle entered the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Earning his master's degree in 1924, he then went on in 1925 to get the first PhD in aeronautics awarded by MIT. 1 year to the PhD. Harvey always likes to remind everyone of that. Doolittle also helped develop the artificial horizon and the directional gyroscope and made the first flight completely by instruments on September 24, 1929, employing the Colesman altimeter in combination with a gyroscopic artificial horizon invented by Lawrence Sperry, a ground-based radio navigation system, and a cockpit navigation display. All of these were the beginnings of all the instrumentation that we use in flight today. He actually proved it possible to fly entirely by the gauges in the cockpit. He later got the Harmon Trophy for his experiments that made all-weather airline operations practical. Between 1925 and 1932, he won the three big air racing trophies of the time, the Schneider Trophy, the Bendix Trophy, and the Thompson Trophy, and then retired from air racing saying, "I have yet to hear anyone engaged in this work dying of old age." In 1930, he left active duty, but he remained a reservist, and he returned to active duty at the outset of the Second World War as a lieutenant colonel when he organized and led the famous raid in over Tokyo. In July 1942, he was assigned to the 8th Air Force, and in September became the commanding general of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. In February 1943, he assumed command of the Anglo-American Strategic Air Force in North Africa. He was promoted to Major General in November, and in March 1943 became commanding general of the North African Strategic Air Forces, which covered the entire central Mediterranean. He then commanded the 15th Air Force as it stood up in late 1943 to run strategic bombing missions over Germany out of the airfields around Foggia in southern Italy. My uncle, as some of you know, actually flew in that Air Force. General Doolittle and General George Patton were friends throughout their careers and throughout the war. In January 1944, Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in England, flying heavy bombers against European targets. He was promoted to lieutenant general shortly after taking command. He held that command until May 1945, and like many soldiers, sailors, and airmen, he began moving to the Pacific in preparation for operations against Japan, which happily proved unnecessary. After the war, General Doolittle, now a civilian and the first president of the Air Force Association, devoted his energies to lobbying for an independent Air Force. In March of 1951, he was appointed Special Assistant to the Air Force Chief of Staff, serving as a scientific advisor on ballistic missile and space programs. He retired from Air Force duty again in 1959, but continued to serve as chairman of the Board of Space Technology Laboratories and devoted his time to many other civic and industry endeavors, and he died on September 23rd of 1993. So we're privileged tonight to honor his memory, and I encourage you to have a wonderful dinner, and when you have finished, we will turn the podium over to the Admiral, who will then tell us a little bit about the state of aviation in the Navy. Thank you. We're going to engage in our usual sort of rude and crude process here towards the speaker, where we ask the speaker to speak while the staff is moving coffee and dessert around, and while you are quietly adding sugar and cream to your coffee. It's my privilege tonight to introduce Admiral Gary Roughead as our Doolittle speaker. Admiral Roughead is a 1973 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Among his 6 operational commands, Admiral Roughead was the first officer to command both classes of Aegis ships, having commanded USS Port Royal CG-73 and my favorite, USS Barry DDG-52, the second in the Burke series. As a flag officer, he commanded Cruiser Destroyer Group 2, the George Washington Battle Group, and U.S. Second Fleet NATO Striking Fleet Atlantic, and Naval Forces North Fleet East. Ashore, he served as Commandant of the United States Naval Academy, the Department of the Navy's Chief of Legislative Affairs, and as Deputy Commander of U.S. Pacific Command. He is one of only 2 officers to have commanded the fleets in the Pacific and Atlantic, commanding the U.S. Pacific Fleet and Joint Task Force 519, as well as U.S. Fleet Forces Command, where he was responsible for ensuring Navy forces were trained, ready, equipped, and prepared to operate around the world where and when needed. I've actually met Admiral Roughead many times, including, I think, for the first time at his home out in Hawaii, when I was actually present in an unofficial capacity. Cindy was present in an official capacity, and I got to go along to a very pleasant dinner at the Admiral's home. Last year, in a more official capacity, I did get to dine at the Admiral's home in Washington with a number of very voluble political scientists who regaled the Admiral with tales of restraint and offshore balancing and the great role that the Navy could play in our versions of U.S. grand strategy. Needless to say, he was happy we were working on his behalf, but I don't think he was quite ready to sign on. Admiral Roughead's awards include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Meritorious Service Medal, Navy Commendation Medal, Navy Achievement Medal, and various unit and service awards. He became the 29th Chief of Naval Operations on September 29th, 2007, and we were fortunate to have him this year because it is the 100th anniversary of naval aviation. So I'd like to turn the podium over to you, Admiral.
thank you, Barry. It's great to be with all of you tonight. Thank you for that introduction. Barry is a favorite ship of mine, and it's been fairly active off the coast of Libya these last few days, which is what we all like to see as we put those great ships into service. But it really is a pleasure to be able to be here with you tonight to talk about sea power, and particularly in this centennial of naval aviation, naval air power, and to be associated with the great Jimmy Doolittle in any respect at all. When I read his academic credentials, I realized that I was clearly not in his league, but it really is, I think, an appropriate time to think about something that just over 2 weeks from today and almost 7 decades ago, that even though Doolittle launched off, I always say that it was Mark Mitcher who launched off those bombers from the deck of the Hornet as they went forward toward Japan. And at that time, it was hailed for good reason as probably one of the most daring innovations. It was a morale booster. It was a psychological victory. And the raid stands out to historians for its discernible impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy and what was to follow. Not the least of all was the timing and the action that took place at what would become the turning point of the war, the Battle of Midway, and the ascendancy of U.S. naval power that continues to this day. I think we're often reminded of the enduring global need for superior sea power, and for me, the last 3 weeks of operations bring into total focus what we do in the Navy and what we anticipated being called upon to do when we wrote our maritime strategy over 3.5 years ago. As you think about these past couple of weeks off of Libya, we deployed ships and submarines that moved from their normal deployed patrol positions and moved into the locations that they needed to be in to launch at the initial engagement over 100 Tomahawk missiles into Libya, and that number has since grown to over 200 missiles. Taking out in kind of a door-busting way the air defenses of the Libyan military, of Libya itself. And it created in very short order the conditions for a no-fly zone to be established and to be imposed on the Libyan regime. At the same time, we had a large deck amphibious ship positioned not too far off the coast that was able, with its Harrier aircraft, to participate in the support that was required. And I think it's also noteworthy that for the first time, the Osprey aircraft, the MV-22, performed what we call its first trap mission, tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel, when it flew in and rescued the pilot of a downed Air Force airplane. I would also say that the operation off of Libya marked the first time that the converted ballistic missile submarine that we have, the Ohio class, that we converted to a guided missile carrying submarine, was used in combat. And it also was the first time that we took the new Growler aircraft, the electronic attack aircraft that we have committed ourselves to in the Navy, and it was on its first operational deployment, and within a period of 48 hours, that squadron relocated from Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq and launched into combat operations in Libya. 47 hours to be exact, from the time of recovery of a combat mission in Iraq to the launch of a combat mission into Libya. The other things, as you look across the globe, and even though the activity was going on in Libya, 2 aircraft carriers remain on station in the North Arabian Sea and the Arabian Gulf, along with a range of other ships and aircraft that are maintaining a presence and indeed a certain sense of stability in an area that we know is undergoing some sweeping and indeed some unprecedented change. Move farther to the east and off of Japan, the Ronald Reagan Strike Group is providing humanitarian assistance and responding to what is, quite frankly, an unprecedented disaster there. Not just the earthquake and the tsunami, but dealing with the issues surrounding the nuclear reactors, where people are heroically working to bring those under control. At the same time, in a somewhat irregular way, our Navy divers from our salvage ships are clearing harbors in Japan that had been disrupted by the tsunami so that trade and supplies can flow more freely into that country. Because of the imperative that each of these situations presented to execute the mission at hand from the sea, my numbered fleet commanders, for the first time in a long time, were commanding the operation in Libya and commanding the humanitarian assistance operation in Japan from our command ships. So in two different places of the world, not only were forces coming from the sea, we were commanding and controlling from the sea one humanitarian, one combat operation that give us incredible capabilities and flexibility. But I think in both cases, when you talk about Libya, when you talk about Japan, the Navy that we met in both cases, the offshore imperative that I believe we have, and we met that with flexible forces that were near or on the scene, a capability that could be scaled up or scaled down, as we're seeing as each day goes by in those operations, to suit the requirements with no or very little requirement for a footprint ashore. And those forces are in sufficient capacity to meet the requirements, even while we continue to support combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I'm often asked whether the maritime strategy that we signed 3.5 years ago, and when I say we, it was signed by myself, by the then Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the then Commandant of the Coast Guard, that I'm often asked, does it apply in today's global security environment? And I say clearly, it still applies. And I'm asked if I could have foreseen the employment of an aircraft carrier for humanitarian assistance and disaster response, and having an adaptable naval force there. I say absolutely. That's what the strategy envisioned, and that's what the strategy is delivering on, to be able to provide that flexibility at any turn that we may find. As you know, we're in the midst of recognizing, as Barry pointed out, the centennial of naval aviation across the country. Just that last month, we celebrated the birth of naval aviation on board the former USS Midway, herself the namesake of what I call one of the Navy's finest hours. And it's now situated across the bay from where naval aviation first took root. And I think the context that's provided by this anniversary is important because we've entered into another period of significant technological change at a time of prolonged and increasing operational activity. Suffice it to say that I see promise for an organization still willing to innovate the way Doolittle, his B-25s, and the Yorktown-class aircraft carrier did in April 7 decades ago. I've been dedicated to preserving that willingness in our Navy, and I'd like to take some time this evening to talk about the future of naval aviation's enduring and novel contributions, especially when the prospect of pressurized budget raises all the old questions about the need for aircraft carriers and naval air forces going forward. First, it's instructive to look back at the personal effort and dedication of motivated sailors and engineers that was required to deliver a capability we can no longer imagine living without. The trail early advocates blazed wasn't without its difficulties, and as with all disruptive technologies, perhaps didn't fully unfold until technology was met by an acute operational demand. but we have their courage and their diligence to thank because naval aviation was ready when our nation needed it. At our Navy's 235th birthday, I recounted with some marvel given my present position how it took less than 3 months to progress from early concepts to a successful ship launch test, something that we were talking about at the table here earlier. And that was not all. By the time Eugene Ely landed on a converted armored cruiser in San Francisco Bay, Navy had already codified the endeavor with $25,000 for test aircraft in the 1911-1912 Naval Appropriations Act. 1912 saw the invention of the deck catapult, which Lieutenant Ellison successfully demonstrated at the Washington Navy Yard. 1 year later, Pensacola Naval Air Station was established, and 2 months after that, naval aviators saw active service as spotters with USS Mississippi off the coast of Veracruz. But while progress may appear orderly and fully supported in hindsight, consider this. Upon the U.S. entry into World War I, more than 6 years after the birth of naval aviation, there were only 38 naval aviators in the Navy. Mitcher himself had recently completed flight training in Pensacola and had been designated Naval Aviator number 33. Captain Chambers had been told to move on by the Navy Department, and for a while, Lieutenant Ellison was running the Naval Aviation Program. Same rank as this young man sitting over here running all of naval aviation. As it turned out, their work was enough to demonstrate a needed capability. By the end of 1918, the Navy boasted 1,650 aviators and had almost 4,000 under training, with over 37,000 total personnel involved in the effort. Looking back, we must applaud those early aviators for anticipating a need, for having a vision of the operational importance of such an oddity as employing aircraft from the decks of ships. It was not a foregone conclusion, and if there was ever any doubt as to the central importance of aviation to our nation's strategic interests, war in the Pacific, just over 2 decades later, would prove our emphasis on carrier-based air power to be prescient and the keystone of a global fleet. Since World War II, advances in nuclear power, guided missiles, ballistic missile submarines, and advanced radar and communications have increased the range, the speed, and the endurance and the lethality of our naval forces. We find ourselves able to do more with fewer ships, aircraft, and people, such that the 65,000 sailors and 40% of our fleet that's deployed on any given day can carry out the 6 core capabilities of our Navy, which are forward presence, deterrence, sea control, power projection, maritime security, and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Today, our Navy represents an offshore option for an uncertain future where we can expect increased demand. The Navy's small footprint offshore and flexible range of capabilities give our nation attractive options to influence events. They allow the United States to remain globally engaged with partners and ensure our access wherever our national interests may dwell. In many respects, naval aviation remains the most visible element of our commitment to global capacity and flexible capabilities. We see it in our forceful international response to the Libyan regime's unacceptable aggression against its own people. We see it over Afghanistan, where after 9 years of war there, Navy tactical aircraft fly from our carriers in the North Arabian Sea and constitute about 30% of the close air support that's provided to our troops on the ground, both American and NATO. And of course, our immediate efforts to support our Japanese allies are greatly aided by that capability. Naval aviation has also shown itself capable of repeatedly revolutionizing warfare. Innovation didn't cease when carrier-based air power was first fielded, or when jet engines permeated the inventory, or even when long-range air-to-air missiles replaced the machine gun. Aircraft in various stages of development today will set new standards and continue to demonstrate the adaptability of naval aviation. This past year, we delivered a 2-generation leap and airborne surveillance with the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft, and we put the P-8 Poseidon test aircraft right to work in advancing advanced anti-submarine warfare sensors. The electromagnetic aircraft launch system that we're developing for the Ford-class aircraft carrier launched its first Hornet this past December, and that will change how naval aviation goes into the future. The Joint Strike Fighter will produce and introduce fifth-generation technology as the next backbone of naval tactical aircraft. And our progress with a family of unmanned systems permits us to reimagine naval warfare once again, where manned ships and aircraft work hand in hand with our unmanned systems to support our information requirements, protect our strike groups at sea, and our sailors, Marines, and soldiers ashore. Recently, the third flight of the X-47B marked yet another milestone in our progress toward an unmanned carrier launch surveillance and strike system, as did somewhat less glamorous but potentially more important tests of a King Air aircraft equipped with the control system that we'll use to operate these unmanned aircraft in the complex electromagnetic environment that exists around our aircraft carrier. I think the important thing is that you can touch each of these systems today. As I often say, they're not just images on a PowerPoint slide. What's more, in some cases, we can derive the benefits of these systems today without new organizational or operational constructs, and that will be our goal. Too often, innovation looks too difficult, too costly, and when we overestimate the depth of change adapting a given technology, that we think it requires a completely new organization. And this is why I continue to press for unmanned integration from the start with the fleet and squadrons we have now. No separate unmanned squadrons, no separate maintenance organizations, but an integrated approach, manned and unmanned, going forward. And as we go forward, however, we must get beyond the cultural history. More quickly than naval aviation took root in our Navy, starting a century ago, so we can adapt empowering and potentially revolutionary capability to our needs. I consider the potential of unmanned aircraft systems to be yet another reason for the Navy to continue rethinking what I call the speed to fleet, the rate at which we deliver capabilities to our sailors. The likelihood that Doolittle's raid could not have happened in today's defense acquisition, development, and test environment requires our most urgent attention. By taking the long view over recent years, the Navy has made strategic and balanced investments in flexible force structure in the midst of highly pressurized budgets, and we have done well heading into this fiscal downturn as a result. With our program for 2012, if we can ever get out from underneath the continuing resolution, we've made great strides toward the carrier variant of the JSF while taking advantage of the hot production line of the Super Hornet to stabilize our aircraft inventory. Crucially, we've pursued an integrated investment approach to networks, to cyber, to electronic warfare and undersea surveillance that recognizes unmanned systems for their initial benefits as gatherers and movers of information. And we started a process toward joint interdependence, most notably with the Air Force, to ensure the military continues to deliver dominance across all domains of the global commons in a more cluttered and potentially disrupted electromagnetic spectrum than we faced in our current conflicts. We're already seeing the benefits of close partnership in developing an air-sea battle concept that will inform everything from our investments to our operations for America's continued advantage against modern anti-access and area denial strategies. Looking forward toward global trends in economics and demographics and resources and climate change and threat proliferation, they point to an even greater demand for credible American sea power and quite clearly for the adaptable force represented by naval aviation's 3,700 aircraft. We will increasingly find ourselves operating at the confluence of unmanned, directed energy, and cyber technologies. There is little doubt that this time of great technological change will require new skills and new models to unlock the potential of developments such as distributed networks, autonomy, power density, and artificial intelligence. In some ways, what we do with today's fleet will seem as outmoded to future generations as those grainy photographs of pitched carrier battles at sea to us today. But we will always have a fleet of naval aircraft in all their forms to host, to integrate, to even drive technological advancements for America's continued maritime dominance. And we will always have a need to be present forward, to be able to respond rapidly to events as various as Haiti and Japan and Libya, and situations as complex and as evolving as what we've experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan and indeed in Libya. With all that is changing in this information age, the requirement for us to come from the sea endures. Naval aviation, for its part, forms a key component of the offshore options our nation will need in the future, and which will not be found anywhere else but in America's Navy. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Before he answers my questions, because I have a long
Okay,
list.
great. Okay, before I begin, I need to bound my time. Chris, how are we good for here? Okay, 40 minutes, so wear me down. First hand was over here.
Sir, could you tell us a little more about what might be the content of the air-sea battle?
Yeah, I would say that people probably think the air-sea battle is going to deliver a whole set of new capabilities, but there will be some of that, but it really is an opportunity for us in the Air Force and for the Marine Corps to come together and look at the doctrine, to look at the organizations that we have, the equipment to be sure, particularly in this information domain that I touched on, and to look at how we collectively go into these anti-access area denial environments. Some of the things we have already, some of the things we have not fully employed. I think one of the great outcomes has been the fact that the Air Force and the Navy basically opened the books to one another so that we could look at where were there unnecessary redundancies. In some cases, we want redundancy, so we've laid that in. But it really gets to this idea of how do you maneuver and how do you work in the anti-access area denial environment. And it's not, there are some who would say that it's all about China. It's not all about China. The technologies that are proliferating around the world today are very different. The ability, for example, to do a non-combatant evacuation of Lebanon that we could do 10 years ago has changed drastically because of what we've seen Hezbollah do against the Israelis. So it really tends to take a look at all of those things that we believe are developments that are designed particularly to keep the capabilities that we have and the capacity that we have out of the fight, and how do we overcome that in technologically, organizationally, and also through our training. Because at the end of the day, our real strength really comes from the ingenuity of our people. And if we unlock that, then we're in a pretty good place. Yes, sir.
Sir, I want to pick up on that in terms of against the near fear, perhaps a near fear that begins with a C.
Mm-hmm.
Between space.
Now, are you closing in on anything in particular? Okay. All right.
Space-based ISR, advanced cruise missiles, advanced terminal guidance ballistic missiles,
Mm-hmm.
very quiet diesel-electric subs. Do you think the carrier still has a prominent role in those sorts of situations?
I think it does, and the reason I would say that is that we often tend to kind of take a look at a particular capability arrayed against a particular capability, and when we move forward, when we operate, there's no question that not only even at the service level are we able to integrate in ways that others can't, but clearly the bringing together of all the joint capabilities is really pretty extraordinary. And so it's easy to take a look at the eaches and say, gosh, we're in a bad position. But I would submit that that there is quite a bit that we unleash as we go forward. That's not to say that the technological changes that are taking place and the advances in warfare and weaponry are not something that I don't take very seriously. I mean, that's been the nature of warfare for some time. You know, as Barry mentioned, there were 4 aircraft carriers that were lost, and you know, there was a great effort to try to take these aircraft carriers out, but we put in place those things that would allow us to protect it, and also to remove the initiative from the adversary. So as you look at the battle space, you have to look at how you bring it all together. It's not a cakewalk, and war will never be immaculate, as far as I'm concerned. But I think oftentimes we tend not to look at the capabilities that we have and not bring those into play. So the importance to me of the carrier is the ability to reposition that power projection, that air power. And as you look at the future, I think one of the things that we will be seeing is an increased sensitivity that nations will have for their own sovereignty. And the thing that the aircraft carrier gives you is the ability to move that air power very quickly without having to secure basing rights, without having to secure overflight rights. And I go back just in my personal experiences of being in the Arabian Gulf on a Sunday afternoon. I remember it very clearly. I was on the exercycle. It was a slow Sunday. Getting a phone call and being told, pick up and move to the Adriatic. And we recovered the airplanes from over Iraq that afternoon. And on the morning of the 8th day, we were launching in the Adriatic. We didn't request permission from anybody. We just moved. Even before that, in 1996, deployed with USS Nimitz. Same thing in the Gulf again. People like to deploy to the Gulf with me because I always get pulled out early. Getting a phone call from the battle group commander saying, take on all the fuel you can, take on the food that you need. We're leaving for the Western Pacific tomorrow morning. And that's when the issue with Taiwan dusted up back in '96. And we moved that air power into the Western Pacific in about a week's time. So, you know, does the nation want to have that type of flexibility, and can you be assured of that access on someone else's soil? And I would also submit that we as a nation will probably have some reluctance in the coming years, maybe even the coming decade, to aggressively introduce large numbers of personnel into a foreign land. I think, you know, some of us are old enough to know that, you know, what happened after Vietnam. We went into a lull. That has changed. I'd let you read the mood of the country today as to, you know, where's the next place where we will want to do something like that. If you're offshore, you can be there and not really be there. The other thing that it affords us the opportunity to do is to engage with other militaries, particularly other navies, in ways that allow us to build a collective capability without some of the political ties that you get if you say, you know, I'm bringing a brigade in to do a ground exercise. Politically, that can be a little sensitive, but carriers, you know, you can play offshore and nobody ever sees that happening. But yet those militaries are coming together in a pretty significant way. Yes, sir.
Admiral, for the last decade or more, the U.S. is still increasingly operating in the littoral region. At the same time, as you point out in your introductory remarks about Libya, our ability to deliver devastating firepower from littoral regions into the sea has gone up. Now we're talking about states trying to deny U.S. access to the littorals and not to promote area denial strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what the thinking is at the Navy is in terms of our role in pushing these states to develop anti-access area denial capabilities and strategies.
Well, I think that as people watch us, not just in that area, they go to school. We touched briefly on China, and I would say that they saw what we as a military did in Desert Storm. They also saw what we did in the Balkans, and that's how countries develop their capabilities. You could say that, and I'm not putting Libya on the same plane, but I would submit that most folks know that if we want to knock the air defenses down, pretty much how we'll go at it. In fact, I was doing some congressional testimony a couple weeks ago, and the topic of the no-fly zone came up, and my comment was, we've done no-fly zones before, but I think it's important that when we talk about a no-fly zone, you have to begin talking about combat operations into another country, because we're going to go in and we're going to knock that stuff down pretty fast. So that's what we did. We also watch how other countries are responding to the developments that we're putting forth, and it's a dynamic game, and that's what we get paid to think through, to plan through. One of the reasons why we invested more heavily in electronic attack in the Navy, and we bought another 4 squadrons of Growlers, because I do believe that the informational domain is going to be a place where the battles will be won and lost. And so how well you can knock down somebody's ability to sense what's going on will be increasingly important. And so if you look at what we've done in the Navy organizationally and structurally with our manpower, we've really put this kind of in the forefront of where we're headed. I know I got a question coming from you. I'm going to start here. So.
Related to these past 2 questions, as we develop the abilities to better defend our aircraft carriers, some of the things we might need to do seem escalatory. For example, if we were dealing with this country that's against the letter C, there may be an incentive to attack submarine bases before the crisis gets worse. There may be an incentive to destroy missiles before the crisis gets worse. And I'm curious, as we work with this dynamic to better defend the carriers, do you see a danger that what we may need to do is escalatory in a crisis?
I think, my experience has been that as you look at a crisis or crises, you spend a great deal of time thinking about the escalation steps. And then I would submit one of the areas that in some of the events and planning that I've been involved in, I look equally at the front end of the de-escalation process. In other words, how do you assess the steps that an adversary may take, that may take, the interpretation of those steps, and is it escalatory or not escalatory, and can you control that escalation? And that's all part of our planning process. That's all part of how we think a problem through. And I would submit that as you step into an operation of any kind where you're going to use lethal force, you need to be able to try to envision the types of things that could happen and where you want to be able to take advantage of the circumstances to be able to de-escalate the conflict. And that's all how you think through. So obviously, as you get into the very end game of a crisis, you not only have to think of it in military terms, but you're really into a political dynamic that really requires all elements of power to come together. And that's just part of our planning process. I think that's one of the areas that, as we have become, quite frankly, a more joint force, and I would submit a force that is more educated in the profession that we have added a bit of sophistication to that process. And we've also committed a lot of our people to a more rigorous planning development process. So it's all part of what we do. Yes, sir, in the back with the.
I'm going to pretend I'm Barry Pose and ask two questions. One to piggyback on the air-sea strategy. Much of the discussion on that is focused on China, and much of that focuses on our need to be able to penetrate to the interior with long-range bombers to take out their surveillance activities so we can maintain sea dominance. To what extent do you think that's a critical element of the air-sea strategy, and how do you perceive questioning what kind of capabilities you need for that? And then second, your discussion of the importance of the carrier for sea command and flexibility. No one would doubt that those are important missions to be able to do, but the question is not whether those are important missions, but the platforms we need to do those with. The Nimitz was first deployed in 1975, so continuing a 50-year cycle. We're talking 2025.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking 2040. We'll still have, if we build no more carriers beyond the Gerald Ford, we'll still have 8 carriers operating in the year 2040.
No, we'll have 10 in 2040.
If we build
Yeah.
no more.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
If we build no more.
Right.
And given the, as you were suggesting, proliferation of assets and Naval capabilities, it's hard to imagine in the year 2040 the carrier will still be a secure platform at sea. Given fiscal constraints, should we begin to change out carrier production and move more committed to the new technologies such as UTAS and SSGN, rather than continuing to use scarce resources to build a platform which in, say, 30 years will have potentially limited value?
Yeah. I think it's a question of how you look into the crystal ball. You know, you mentioned Nimitz. An example I use is Enterprise. Tonight, as we're here, she's flying close air support in Afghanistan. Her first mission was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The type of airplane that has flown off of that ship has changed dramatically. So the question is not so much, do you forego the airfield, or do you change the capability that you can put on that airfield? And so I think that is where we go. I would also say that if you stop the build, and right now we're building on about 5-year centers, what we call every 5th year we start a new one, that industrial base will be gone. And are we willing to do, you know, total unmanned? Do we have in place the technology that can give us that unmanned, you know, full capability? My sense is we're probably not far enough along the line for artificial intelligence, particularly in some of the air-to-air work that we're involved in. And it's a question of, are you willing to forego that capability? Those are the decisions that we make, and at least for the foreseeable future, the commitment has been made to continue this production that gives us that level of flexibility. There's no question that unmanned aircraft are going to change how you can use the carrier, whether you bring everyone from the continental United States or not, whether you want to keep those vehicles up in the air that long. But you know, my view, and you would expect it from the uniform I wear, that ability to put that presence in place, to put that capability in place, has been quite valuable. If, in fact, there's a question about the value of carriers, I also look at what the Chinese are doing right now, and you know, they have a carrier program going forward. And I'm not saying that we need to keep building them because they need to, but I think that there is value in being able to have these bases that move on the world's oceans, that give you some flexibility that 20, 30 years from now we may no longer enjoy ashore. So that's where I am on that. Sir?
Sir, related to some of your earlier questions, a lot of discussion about symmetric kinetic capabilities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the cyber domain. The media is hyping up, in particular, again, with respect to China,
Mm-hmm.
asymmetric cyber capabilities against the U.S. military. I was wondering if you could talk about how that. I have to assume, I'm kind of on the fence with this, I have to assume that we're as good, if not better, than a lot of the other nations in this domain. But how long do you think that might persist, and how that affects the future conflict scenarios, and how you interact with China?
Yeah. I would say that cyber is going to play very heavily. It's one of the reasons why we've done the reorganizations that we have, not just within our ability to make decisions about future capabilities and how we think our way through that, but we created a separate cyber command in the Navy that has global responsibilities. That command for us is somewhat unique. It's the only fleet commander that we tend to break ourselves down in that way, who has global authority. Everyone else is more geographically aligned. He's also the only fleet commander that I've given a certain amount of budget authority to, so that he can expend resources as he needs them to move in a domain that moves faster than anything else we've had to deal with. It's also why we've taken all of the individuals that are involved in, I don't say cyber, I say information, because if you sense the environment, if you analyze the information, if you transport it, or you are responsible for maintaining all those networks, we've put everybody into what we call the Information Dominance Corps. That's 45,000 people. And I think that's where the beginnings of the fight will be. I would submit that technically it is probably one of the most exciting games that you could be in, because it really is a game of the mind. But I would say that one of the areas that we often tend not to talk about in the cyber world is really the policy aspect of it. We tend to get into the technical pretty quickly, but I would submit that the harder part is really the policy. When you're dealing in the .com, the .mil, the .edu, the .gov, what are the authorities, what are the rules, how can you move in those domains? That's some pretty complex stuff. And who's responsible for countering an attack? You know, is an attack worse on military capability, or is it worse to go after the financial sector? And you can get into some pretty, heady discussions about that. And I think that's an area where there still is a lot of work to do. We also, when we created the Information Dominance Directorate and the 10th Fleet and the Information Dominance Corps, we also, within our Judge Advocate General Corps, created a cyber law division to start getting young lawyers involved in thinking about what kind of laws of warfare that deal particularly with cyber are we going to have to come to grips with in the future. And that's pretty much a fledgling area that we're into. But I think it's going to be hugely important. We see activity every day. But I will tell you that we have some incredible operators on our own part. Without getting into a lot of detail, during one of the exercises, the 10th Fleet commander had something done that was really pretty, it was pretty neat actually. And he went up to a young first-class petty officer, young enlisted person, been in the Navy for maybe about 8-9 years. And he said, "How long did it take you to be able to do that?" And his sense was that this young man had been working on it for a couple weeks. And the guy just looked at him and said, about 25 minutes. And you just see these young people. And I think but that's the other great challenge, is how do we retain those individuals? Because unlike many other areas in the military and the Navy, this is a specialty that is greatly sought after by all sectors of society. And so as I look at cyber, I also look at the human capital and how do I preserve, how do I develop it, how do I then retain it, and how do I incentivize it. Yes, sir.
Yes, Admiral. We've been in Libya for almost 2 weeks now.
Mm-hmm.
As we transition over to NATO. My question has to do with what you see as the nature of that conflict over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, I think it's probably too early to call. I think we've seen some movement on the part of the opposition, movement on the part of the regime. The regime has adapted different techniques because they realized, I think, that the larger formations going forward probably have targets on them, so they're not doing that. I believe that we will be in a phase where we're trying to figure out who the opposition is and what the authority structures are in that. And so I think in the coming weeks, it's going to be pretty dynamic. That may sound like a dodge, but I think I see that.
More had to do with the air operations and how those are going to kind of transfer over, and if you, what you see as your major concerns, any red flags that arise.
Yeah.
Because it appears to me in the statements that it's more of a long-term operation potentially, and so what are your concerns with opening this third front?
Well, I think a large part of the air power that's being used is non-U.S. So, it now is a relatively benign environment that we're flying over. I think the biggest issue is as you deal with the actions that the regime may be taking against its people, how are you able to really discern what's going on the ground, and is there potential for mistakes and missteps and some damage that you don't want? I would say that's probably the biggest challenge that we're going to face as far as the no-fly zone goes. Yes, sir.
A few years ago, Admiral, you commissioned a study for the Academy on the Navy and climate.
Right.
And it's been really interesting, the Arctic. This is more of a long-term question. What does the Navy stand on that in terms of global warming?
Yeah, and global warming and
Issues of
yeah.
the whole Navy scenario.
Yeah. What for me, it's been a pretty an area of great interest. About 2 years ago, around the time I commissioned the study, I also created Task Force Climate Change, which was for us to look at the Navy and what does it mean. And a lot of folks said, well, it's all about the Arctic. The Arctic obviously weighs very heavily because it is a significant change. I refer to it as the opening of the fifth ocean. And we haven't had an ocean open since the end of the Ice Age. So it's a big deal. But Task Force Climate Change also looks at what's happening in other places of the world, sea level rise, the demographic of people compressing to the coast, the mega cities that are forming, and issues such as water, where will the frictions develop. So it tries to look at that. We believe that the Arctic, as far as a profitable and routine transportation route, is probably 2.5 decades away. But we think the fishing fleets will start to migrate north as the fish move with water temperature. The next step, I believe, will be mineral extraction in the Arctic. And then we'll get into transit route up there, which is I think the point where we are is to look at what does that mean for the Navy, what does that mean with regard to designs, what does that mean for the types perhaps of overhead architecture that you may need to operate there, and so how does that figure into our view to the future and our budget calculations, and when do we have to start laying things in, because in this job, kind of to use the old winemaker's theory, I spend no money before it's time. And so when do you start investing in those types of things? So I think, that's a key part. One thing that I believe is of immediate importance to all of us, and there may be some differing opinions, But we are opting out of the Arctic. As a nation, we are opting out of the Arctic because we're not party to the Law of the Sea Convention. And there are people who believe we should be in or shouldn't be in, but we will not have a seat at the table. We will not be able to exercise the leadership that so many countries who look to us for our maritime leadership expect of us. We won't be there. And so to me, that's an immediate issue, because if you believe that the fishing issues, the mineral issues are going to be upon us soon, people are going to start worrying about the claims. And the claims will be adjudicated through the Law of the Sea Convention, and we're not going to be there. And so, do I see it have any movement? I think it will. Not only did that report, but there have been some other studies as well. There have been some war games that we have run where people from outside the Department of Defense and even outside the country have advocated for it, and I'm hopeful that we can move it forward. That said, it will be part of a political agenda within the Congress, and I will continue to advocate this as strongly as I can, wherever I may be. Yes, sir.
Sir, I want to ask you, earlier given this talk, maybe a month or two ago, given the mission in Libya, if not your perspective on how the Navy would operate in the future, but certainly the reception to how the Navy would operate, how has that changed given the Libyan operation?
Quite frankly, it really hasn't changed that much. I mean, we were there, we were on station. That's kind of the way that we position our forces. We look to build our fleet with as much capability across a range of conflict. The type of ship that fired Tomahawks into Libya was the ship that had been on station a couple of days before doing ballistic missile defense in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the type of ship that the SEALs staged from to rescue Captain Phillips of the Maersk, Alabama. So it's easy, I think, as people look at force structure, the types of things we have, to say you need a ship for counter-piracy, and you need a ship to do this, and you need a ship to do that, or you need a capability to do that. We don't have the checkbook that's big enough to do it, so there will be some capabilities that reside at the far ends of each range of the spectrum. I really want our nuclear deterrent to be the nuclear deterrent, and that's what they do. They do it very well, and that's a pretty exclusive group at one end. I really like having SEALs that are the best at the other end. But in between, I think we have to look at how do we get the most out of that which we put around the world globally. And, Ronald Reagan, great aircraft carrier, can generate more combat power probably than any other entity around, and yet it's the kingpin of the humanitarian assistance relief operation in Japan. And the sailors there are as comfortable doing that mission as they are doing the high-end mission. Okay, I've got this one here.
It fits right into this. The Navy's new recruiting slogan is America's Navy, a global force for good.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be happy to know I have an unpublished op-ed, and no one wants it for sure. It's titled, "Who Wants to Pay for the Salvation Navy?"
Right.
So, rather than ask you to deal with those cogent arguments in that op-ed, let me ask you about the origins of that slogan, because I'm sure you're
Right.
involved with it, and how it's been received not only in the public but among the other services.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, I guess maybe there's an unwritten rule that we don't criticize one another's slogans, and probably a good thing to do. It's easy, you can touch a nerve that way. But I would say it's on a couple of levels. We have found it to be helpful in a couple of ways. I think everyone wants to, particularly those who live in this country. At the end of the day, we really are quite nice people. I mean, we really are. We as a culture, as a nation, if you look at any serviceman or woman walking down the street in Iraq or Afghanistan and a young kid comes out, I can almost guarantee how that soldier, Marine, or whoever it may be is going to respond. I would submit that that's not always the case. So I think it appeals to our better senses. And I could also argue that sometimes you do good when you shape events with a hammer. Is stopping what was going on in Libya a good act or not a good act? I could say it's probably a good act. So you could put it there. The other thing that I believe is true today, and we can debate whether there's value in the work that we have done from the humanitarian side. But since 2005, from our ships alone, just from our ships, we have treated over 500,000 people in other countries. Now, treating may be giving them a pair of eyeglasses. It may be a very significant operation. It may be teaching a class of nurses in Holo Island in the Philippines. But young people in this country today, they derive a great deal of satisfaction with that. We don't minimize the fact that those who are in the Navy will be called upon to go in harm's way, will be called upon to potentially inflict damage on others. But at the same time, we are a bit different as a nation, and I think especially as we look at attracting young men and women, there's a little bit of appeal to that. But I would submit that the global force for good can span a range of things. Is doing good protecting another country from ballistic missile defense? I would submit it is. And so where do you put where does good come down on the spectrum? And so it is seemed to play quite well. And I believe that the nature of the maritime partnerships, the global maritime partnerships that we've entered into has been facilitated by having a dimension that has a little bit of a different side to it than simply, let's go out and blow some stuff up. Yes, sir.
So in the early years of naval aviation, we saw battleship admirals who were pretty willing to embrace a spotting role for aircraft, but much more effectively, much more loosely to a strike role. And just hearing the way the Navy talks about UAVs now, where they're seen great surveillance asset, but I just wonder if there's an analogy there. Sort of, is there institutional barriers to pointedly utilizing that?
No, I don't think so. In fact, we're in the process, if we get out from under the CR, I always have to get my CR ads in here. If we get out from under the CR, we have money, we have engineering going toward arming our vertical takeoff UAV. The objective we have for 2018 and a squadron of unmanned carrier aircraft includes a strike capability on that. So there's no question in my mind that I think initially the UAVs will largely be information or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, but they're getting armed up. I would also say that as you look at the unmanned underwater systems, which I think potentially have greater game-changing qualities than unmanned air, there will be lethality associated with those. We have to be able to go in and inflict damage when we want to be able to do that. And I think the unmanned allows you to go into areas that you haven't been able to go into before. So no question in our minds about making those systems a lot more lethal. Yes, sir.
Sir, just I guess a service question. As an Air Force fellow, and I sit and have conversations with some of the other fellows here in the greater Boston area, one of the questions that tends to come up often from the students in the area is, where's the Navy fellow? And I guess, I
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I would say, I think I actually had the last Navy fellow that come through work for me when I was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. So, and we did pare back on a lot of our fellowships, and we did collapse back into Washington. What I think you would see is we've pushed fellows back out again. But at the same time, I'm also mindful of the number of people that I have, the number of, we pushed into the individual augmentees, for example, but I know the Air Force has as well. But I have 465 commanders and captains who are on IAs. If they weren't on IAs, and these are sailors that are not assigned to a particular unit, but just, or a Navy unit, where would those people be? They very well could be here. I will also tell you that one of the expansions that we did was to push some of the fellows into some cyber institutions to begin to see if it's worth that. But it is a gradual climb out that we are on. Some of the alignment is really to pull some from Washington, put them back out again. And so, my hope is that we'll be able to continue to increase the number, because I do believe that it's beneficial for the fellow to be in an environment like this. And I would also hope that those who are here benefit from the perspectives of the fellows. It's a two-way street from my standpoint. It did atrophy, and we're trying to build it back up.
So to just say, I'm drafting a letter now to Captain Stuart Munch in N51, who's in charge of this program.
Right.
Any leverage you have on our behalf would be
Okay. All right. And I think I have Stu's next assignment in my hands, so I got it, not. So I got a lot of leverage, I think there was a young lady in the back.
I have a follow-up question to the question earlier about the utility of carriers in 4 years from now, when we still have 10. So I can imagine a lot of technological advances in scoping areas that would be a lot better than aircraft carriers. For example, launches of a little colonial carrier, for example, here. Um, so is there an impetus for trying other technology and sort of developing that and investing in that? That seems like instead of sort of continuing to put money into building carriers, there's other technologies that might be better to test. And is there an interest at all to develop that, or do you not feel like?
No, I think that as you look at efforts into unmanned, the whole focus on cyber, I think those are, because as I tell everyone, if I can stop something at the left end of the kill chain, I'd rather do that than have to work at the right end, which is the more kinetic end.
You said that you would put a carrier who, gets air power. So if you project air power, I believe it's only a few kilometers an hour in other ways.
Right.
So is there at all like an effort to try and invest in that technology, or is that something that you're going?
Yeah, I think that it's a question of where you want to operate that air power from. Will our unmanned systems, do you want to be present in a particular area, or do you want everything in a remote area? And let me just draw a comment. I was with a country that we enjoy a very good relationship with, and we have been doing some training, some global training that we do in a distributed way, so that, for example, I can have people in San Diego, and I can have people in Sydney, Australia, conducting an exercise in South America, or they think it's an exercise in South America. This country is quite technologically advanced. It's in Asia. And I said, how would you like to be part of this? Because I think this would be a great opportunity. It would be great for some, coalition building. And I thought there'd be an enthusiastic response. And the question was, are you pulling out of Asia? That was the concern. So there is a value to presence. And I guess the question is, how do you demonstrate the presence? How do you make it a credible presence? And how do you also make sure that people know it's there? And is there value in that? And that's the calculus that I think you get into. We can talk about the technological capabilities. We can talk about the virtual approach. But, do you want that presence there? As I said, right now, there are several aircraft carriers out doing some fairly heavy lifting that commanders in the region, that partners in the region find valuable. Are you willing to forego that for some other presence? And I have not seen anything that has the same effect. Obviously, there are some in the room who have a different opinion, and that's fine. But I think that presence makes a difference. But it has to be credible. And what's the substitute is the question. Yes, sir.
Sir, I guess I have a more personal question.
Yeah.
Any indication who your relief will be?
Yeah. Not my choice, but I kind of know what the field is. Okay. No. Do we?
Has your staff given you the high sign yet, or have they all exited the area?
We're ready to.
Is it closed? Okay.
Okay.
That's right. They all want to get back to Washington.
That's right.
Even if you don't, you can always stay at our house.
That's right.
We have an extra room, but
I'm reasonably sure the plane won't leave
I don't
without
think
me.
I can accommodate the entire. You never know; they may play a trick on you. But before you leave, we just would like to present you with this plaque that honors General
Fantastic.
Doolittle and honors your presence here this
Thank you
evening.
very much.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks. Thank you. We got to get a picture there. There you go.
Before we all leave, I want to acknowledge the work here of our field general tonight, Harley and Noel.
Here, here. Great. Thank you very much. Good luck to you all. Thanks.